I didn't notice it the day it happened. There was no argument. No moment where someone said something sharp or final. No door slammed, no silence that felt sudden or dramatic. If anything, it was a normal day. That's what stayed with me later, how ordinary it all was. Because when I think back now, trying to find the exact moment things changed, I don't see anything obvious. Just a series of small, quiet moments that, at the time, didn't seem important enough to remember. But they were. I just didn't know it yet. I woke up that morning the same way I always do. Early. Before the house had fully settled into the day. There's a certain kind of quiet that only exists in those early hours. Not empty, just waiting. Like the house itself is taking a breath before everything begins. I went into the kitchen, turned on the light above the sink, and reached for the coffee maker without thinking. The routine is so familiar now that I don't have to pay attention to it anymore. Water, filter, coffee grounds. The same sequence I've followed for years. I used to make more. That's something I still haven't quite adjusted. Back when the kids were here, I would fill the whole pot without thinking. There was always someone coming in behind me, asking for a cup, grabbing a piece of toast, rushing through their morning with that half-awake energy that never seemed to slow them down. Now I still measure the same amount sometimes. Out of habit, I guess. And then I pour half of it down the sink later. That morning, I caught myself doing it again. I stood there for a second, looking at the full pot, and almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was familiar in a way that felt a little strange. I adjusted. Made less. Sat down at the table. And for a while, everything felt normal. The light coming through the window. The quiet hum of the refrigerator. The faint sound of a car passing outside. All the small things that make up a morning when no one else is around. I picked up my phone, more out of habit than intention. Scrolled through messages. Nothing new. That didn't surprise me. It wasn't unusual for there to be gaps now. Still, I checked. Just in case. I set it down again and took a sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle in slowly. There was a time when mornings didn't feel like this. Not better, necessarily. Just fuller. Busier. I remember those mornings clearly, even now. Back when the kids were young, everything started earlier. There was always someone awake before they were supposed to be, or someone refusing to get out of bed when they needed to. I used to move through the house with a kind of quiet urgency. Making breakfast. Packing lunches. Calling out reminders from the bottom of the stairs. Don't forget your homework. Where are your shoes? You're going to be late. There was always something. And somehow, in the middle of all that noise, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. I was part of everything. Not just present. Necessary. That's the word that keeps coming back to me lately. Necessary. It's a simple word, but it carries more weight than I ever realized. At the time, I didn't think about it. You don't when you're in it. You just respond. To what's needed. To what's happening right in front of you. There's no space to step back and analyze it. No reason to. It just is. And then, gradually, it isn't. I didn't notice the shift when it started. I don't think anyone does. It happens quietly. So quietly that you mistake it for something temporary. They grow older. They need less help with small things. They start solving problems on their own. Making decisions without asking. At first, it feels like progress. Like you've done your job well. I remember the first time one of them told me, "I've got it," when I offered to help. It was such a small thing. But it stayed with me. Not in a bad way. Just noticeable. There was pride in it. Of course there was. That's what you want as a parent. To raise someone who can handle things on their own. But there was something else, too. Something I didn't have a name for at the time. Looking back now, I think it was the beginning of understanding that my role was changing. Not disappearing. Just shifting. The years passed the way they always do. Quietly, until they don't feel quiet anymore. School became more demanding. Schedules became more complicated. Their lives started expanding beyond the house in ways that were both exciting and distant. Dinner used to be the one constant. No matter how busy the day was, we came back together in the evening. Not perfectly. Not every single night. But often enough that it felt like a rhythm. A routine. Something we all returned to. I would cook. They would drift in and out of the kitchen, talking about their day in pieces. Half-finished sentences. Stories that didn't always have a clear point. Arguments over small things that didn't matter. Laughter that filled the space without effort. It wasn't anything special. At least, that's what I thought at the time. It was just life. And like most things that are part of everyday life, I assumed it would always be there. In some form. But it changed. Gradually. At first, it was small. I have practice. I'm meeting friends. I'll eat later. You adjust. You leave food out. You tell yourself it's temporary. That things will settle again. Sometimes they do. But not in the same way. Over time, those moments at the table became less frequent. Less consistent. Until one day, you realize you've stopped expecting everyone to be there. That realization doesn't hit all at once. It builds. Quietly. Just like everything else. The house started to feel different. Not empty. Not yet. But quieter in a way that didn't feel temporary anymore. Rooms stayed cleaner. Schedules didn't overlap the same way. There were fewer interruptions. Fewer moments where someone needed something right away. And again I told myself this was normal. This was how it was supposed to be. They were growing up. Building their own lives. That was the goal. I believed that. I still do. But belief doesn't always match how something feels when you're living it. The first time the house felt too quiet, I remember exactly where I was. Standing in the kitchen. Late afternoon. The light coming in at that angle it only does for a short time before evening. I had just finished making dinner. More out of habit than necessity. I looked at the table. Set for more people than were actually there. And for a second, I just stood there. Waiting. Even though I knew there was no one coming in right away. That feeling didn't last long. I shook it off. Adjusted. Sat down. Ate. But something about it stayed with me. Not as a problem. Just a moment. One of many. The kind you don't think about too much at the time. But later, you realize it was part of something bigger. The calls changed too. That's something I noticed more clearly. At first, they were frequent. Updates about school, friends, plans. Questions about things they weren't sure about. Small things. Big things. Everything in between. I listened the same way I always had. Gave advice when it felt right. Stayed quiet when it didn't. Just present. That was always enough. Then, over time, the calls became shorter. More focused. Less open-ended. I'm busy, but everything's good. I'll call you later. We should catch up soon. Soon. That word started to lose its meaning. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into longer stretches. Not because anything was wrong. Just because life moved forward. For them. And I stayed where I was. Still part of it. But not in the same way. One afternoon, I found myself sitting at the table again, phone in front of me. Thinking about calling. Just to check in. Just to hear their voice. I picked it up. Put it down. Picked it up again. There was a hesitation there that hadn't existed before. Not fear. Not even doubt. Just uncertainty. About whether I was stepping into a moment that belonged to them now. That was new. There was a time when I didn't question that. When I knew I was part of their day in a way that didn't need to be scheduled or considered. Now, I wasn't so sure. I didn't call. Not that day. I told myself I would later. And maybe I did. I don't remember. What I do remember is the feeling. That small shift. The beginning of something I couldn't fully name yet. It wasn't loss. Not exactly. It was more like space. Growing. Quietly. Between what used to be immediate and what had become occasional. That evening, I went through my usual routine. Dinner. Cleaning up. Sitting in the living room with the TV on, even though I wasn't really watching it. The house was still. Comfortably so. And yet, not entirely. I found myself looking at my phone again. Not expecting anything specific. Just checking. It stayed silent. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the room. At the furniture that hadn't moved in years. At the small details that used to go unnoticed because there was always something else happening. And I felt something I hadn't quite allowed myself to feel before. Not sadness. Not fully. Just distance. Not the kind you can measure. The kind you feel. The kind that settles in slowly, until one day you realize it's been there for a while. I didn't think much of it then. I didn't sit there and analyze it. I didn't try to understand what it meant. I just let it pass. The way you do with most things that don't seem urgent. But looking back now, I think that was around the time something started to change. Not in them. In me. A small awareness. A quiet recognition. That the way things had always been might not be the way they were going to stay. I didn't talk about it with anyone. Not at that stage. There wasn't anything clear enough to explain. If someone had asked me, I would have said everything was fine. And in many ways it was. No arguments. No falling out. No dramatic distance that could be pointed to and named. Just life moving forward. And me, noticing it in a way I hadn't before. A few days after that evening, I decided to call. Not because something was wrong. Just because it had been a while. I remember standing in the kitchen again, phone in my hand, looking out the window the way I do when I'm thinking about something I can't quite define. The sky was overcast. That kind of flat, quiet gray that makes everything feel a little slower. I pressed the call button. It rang longer than I expected. Not enough to be concerning. Just enough to notice. When it finally picked up, the voice on the other end sounded slightly distracted. Hey, I said, trying to keep my tone light, familiar. Just checking in. How are things? Good. Yeah, everything's good. Just a bit busy. I nodded, even though they couldn't see me. Busy is good. There was a short pause. Not uncomfortable. Just empty. I waited for them to fill it the way they used to. With a story. A complaint. Something small that didn't really matter but felt important in the moment. But nothing came. So I asked a question. Something simple. How's work going? It's fine. Same as usual. A lot going on. Another pause. And again I felt it. That small gap where something used to be. We talked for a few more minutes. About schedules. Plans. Things that were happening in their life that I wasn't directly part of anymore. I listened. Really listened. But I realized something as the conversation went on. I was listening as someone outside the moment. Not inside it. There's a difference. It's subtle, but once you feel it, you can't ignore it. Eventually they said, I've got to run in a minute. Of course, I replied quickly. I just wanted to hear your voice. Yeah, we'll talk soon. There was that word again. Soon. Okay, I said. And then the call ended. I stood there for a moment after. Phone still in my hand. Listening to the silence that followed. Trying to understand why something so normal felt so unfamiliar. I didn't feel hurt. Not in the way you might expect. It was more like something had shifted slightly out of alignment. Not enough to break anything. Just enough that it didn't fit the same way it used to. I set the phone down and went back to what I had been doing. But I carried that feeling with me. It didn't leave. It just settled quietly in the background. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing patterns. Small ones. The kind that don't stand out unless you're paying attention. Messages that were shorter than they used to be. Plans that were mentioned after they happened, not before. Conversations that stayed on the surface. Polite. Friendly. But contained. And I realized something else. I was the one reaching out more often. Not constantly. Not in a way that felt excessive. But enough that I noticed the balance had changed. They still responded. Always. Kindly. But rarely first. I tried not to read too much into it. I reminded myself of everything they were managing now. Work. Relationships. Responsibilities I used to carry for them. It made sense. It really did. But understanding something doesn't always make it easier to accept. One evening, I decided to cook a proper meal. Not just something simple. A full dinner. The kind I used to make when everyone was home. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe I missed the routine. Or maybe I wanted to feel, just for a moment, like things hadn't changed as much as they had. I took my time. Chopping vegetables slowly. Letting the stove warm the room. Moving through the steps the way I had done hundreds of times before. There was comfort in it. Familiarity. A rhythm that hadn't disappeared, even if the people it was meant for had moved on. At some point, without thinking, I set the table for more than one. It was automatic. Plates. Glasses. Cutlery. Arranged the way they had always been. I stepped back and looked at it. And that's when it hit me. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just, clearly. There was no one coming. I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I quietly picked up the extra plates and put them away. The room felt different after that. Not emptier. Just more honest. I ate alone. The food tasted the same. But the experience didn't. There's something about sharing a meal that you don't fully appreciate until you're not doing it anymore. It's not just about eating. It's about the conversation. The interruptions. The small, overlapping moments that make everything feel connected. Without that, it becomes something else. Something quieter. More contained. After dinner, I didn't turn on the TV right away. I just sat there. Looking at the table. At the one plate in front of me. At the chair across from me that used to be filled without question. And I let myself feel it. Not resist it. Not explain it away. Just feel it. That was new. I hadn't done that before. I had always moved past things quickly. Adjusted. Focused on what was next. But this time, I stayed with it. And in that stillness, something became clearer. It wasn't that I wasn't loved. I knew I was. There was no doubt about that. What had changed was something else. I was no longer part of the immediate. The everyday. The things that happened without planning. Without thought. I had moved, just slightly outside of that space. Not intentionally. Not by anyone's decision. Just, naturally. The way life unfolds. A few days later, I heard about a small gathering. Not from an invitation. From a conversation. "Oh yeah, we all got together last weekend," they said casually. It took me a moment to process it. "All?" I asked. "Yeah, just everyone. Nothing big." I nodded. "That sounds nice." It was. And then the conversation moved on. But I didn't. I stayed there for a moment. On that word. Everyone. I didn't ask why I hadn't been included. Not because I didn't want to know. But because I wasn't sure I was ready to hear the answer. There are questions that, once asked, change something. And I wasn't ready for that yet. So I let it go. Or at least I tried to. That evening, I walked through the house slowly. Not looking for anything. Just moving. From one room to another. Noticing things I hadn't paid attention to in a long time. The way the light hit the wall in the hallway. The small scratches on the table from years of use. The photos. Always the photos. There's one in particular that I stopped in front of. All of us together. Smiling. Close. Not forced. Just there. In that moment. I tried to remember exactly what that day felt like. Not just what we did, but how it felt to be part of it without question, without distance, without thinking about where I fit. Because back then, I didn't have to think about it. I just knew. I stood there for a long time. Longer than I realized. And then, slowly, I stepped away. That night, I didn't check my phone as much. Not because I didn't want to, but because I already knew. Nothing had changed. At least, not in the way I had once expected. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Made my coffee. Sat at the table. And this time, I didn't try to distract myself. I didn't scroll through anything. I didn't turn on the TV. I just sat there. With the quiet. And with the thought that had been forming slowly, piece by piece. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't overwhelming. It was just there. Clear in a way it hadn't been before. The day I realized I was no longer important. Wasn't a single day at all. It was a collection of moments. Small. Ordinary. Easy to overlook. Until they weren't. And sitting there that morning, I understood something I hadn't fully allowed myself to see. It wasn't that I had lost my place in their lives. It was that my place had changed. And I hadn't quite caught up to it yet. I took a slow sip of coffee. Let the warmth settle. And for the first time, I didn't try to push that realization away. I just sat with it. Not knowing yet what it meant, but knowing it mattered. I sat with that thought longer than I expected. Not analyzing it. Not trying to fix it. Just letting it be there. There's something that happens when you stop pushing a feeling away. It doesn't disappear, the way you might hope it would. But it changes shape. It becomes clearer. Less heavy, in a way, because you're not fighting it anymore. That morning, I finished my coffee more slowly than usual. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't turn anything on for background noise. I just listened to the quiet. And for the first time, it didn't feel like something I needed to fill. It just existed. Later that day, I decided to go out. Not for anything specific. Just to move. To be somewhere that wasn't defined by memories I kept walking past. There's a small park a few blocks away. I've passed it countless times over the years, usually on the way to somewhere else. When the kids were younger, we used to go there occasionally. Not often enough to make it a routine, but enough that I recognized the paths, the benches, the way the light filters through the trees in the late afternoon. I hadn't been there in a while. I walked slowly. No destination. No urgency. Just walking. The air was cool, but not cold. That kind of in-between weather that doesn't demand anything from you. There were a few people scattered around. A couple sitting on a bench, talking quietly. A man walking a dog. And off to one side, a parent with a young child. The child was running ahead, stopping every few steps to look back. Making sure someone was still there. I watched them for a moment. Not in a way that felt intrusive. Just noticing. There was a rhythm to it. The child moving forward, exploring. The parent following, watching. Not stopping them. Not holding them back. Just being there. And every few seconds the child would turn. Look. Confirm. Then keep going. It was such a simple thing. Something I had seen, lived, experienced without thinking about it when my own children were that age. But standing there now, it felt different. Because I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. There comes a point when they stop turning around. Not suddenly. Not all at once. But gradually. They take a few more steps before checking. Then a few more. Until one day, they don't check at all. Not because they've forgotten you. Not because they don't care. But because they've learned how to move forward without needing that constant reassurance. And that's not a failure. That's the goal. It just doesn't feel the way you imagine it will when you're the one standing still. I sat down on a bench. Watched for a while longer. Let that thought settle. Not as something painful. But as something true. When I got home later that afternoon, the house felt the same as it always did. Quiet. Familiar. But something in me had shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way that changed everything all at once. Just enough that I noticed it. I wasn't waiting in the same way anymore. That evening, I made dinner again. Simple this time. Nothing elaborate. I set the table for one without thinking. And for the first time, it didn't feel like something was missing. It just felt accurate. After I ate, I cleaned up, wiped down the counter, turned off the lights one by one. The routine. The same as always. But the feeling underneath it was different. I sat down in the living room. The same chair. The same position. And I thought about calling again. Not out of habit this time. But because I wanted to. That difference mattered. I picked up the phone. Scrolled for a moment. Then stopped. Not because I changed my mind. But because I realized something. I didn't need to call to prove anything. Not to them. Not to myself. The connection was still there. It just didn't live in the same place it used to. And maybe that was okay. A few days later, I sent a message. Not a long one. Not anything heavy. Just simple. Thinking about making dinner this weekend. You're welcome to come by if you're free. No expectations. No pressure. I sent it, set the phone down, and went about my day. For the first time, I didn't check it every few minutes. I let time pass the way it does when you're not watching it. Eventually, the replies came. I think I can make it. I'll try. Depends on work. And then later. I'll be there. I read them once. Then again. Not with relief. Not with validation. Just acknowledgement. That this is how things work now. Not guaranteed. Not automatic. But still, there. The day they came over, I found myself moving through the house with a familiar kind of energy. Not rushed. Not anxious. Just present. I cooked. More than I needed to. Out of habit, I suppose. Or maybe out of memory. The table was set. Not out of expectation this time. But as an invitation. When they arrived, it wasn't dramatic. No big moment. No emotional reunion. Just normal. A knock at the door. A greeting. A hug. Slightly different than it used to be. A little more measured. But real. We sat down together. Talked. Not about everything. Not in the same way we once did. But enough. There were pauses. But they weren't empty. Just natural. I listened. Not waiting to be needed. Not trying to guide the conversation. Just there. At one point, I looked around the table. Really looked. At who they had become. At how they spoke, how they carried themselves, how they moved through their own lives now. And I felt something shift again. But this time, it wasn't loss. It was something else. Something quieter. A kind of understanding. All those years. All those routines. All those moments that felt ordinary at the time. They hadn't disappeared. They had simply expanded. Beyond me. Into lives that didn't revolve around me anymore. And that didn't make me unimportant. It just meant I wasn't the center anymore. After dinner, we lingered for a while. No one rushed to leave. But no one stayed too long either. That's how it is now. A balance. One by one, they gathered their things. Said their goodbyes. Stepped back into their own lives. I stood at the door after the last one left. Not because I was waiting. Just standing. Taking in the quiet that returned. The same quiet. But not the same feeling. I went back into the kitchen. Looked at the table. At the empty plates. At the small signs that people had been there not long ago. And instead of clearing everything right away, I sat down. In the same chair. In the same place. And I let myself feel it. Not what had changed. But what remained. Because that's what I hadn't fully seen before. I had been so focused on the idea of no longer being important. That I hadn't stopped to ask what that word really meant. Important doesn't always look like it did in the past. It doesn't always mean being needed for every small thing. It doesn't always mean being at the center of someone's day. Sometimes, it means being part of the foundation. Something steady. Something that doesn't need to be constantly visible to still exist. I may not be the first person they call anymore. I may not be part of every plan. I may not know every detail of their lives as it happens. But I am still part of their lives. Just differently. More quietly. Less urgently. But still, meaningfully. And maybe the day I realized I was no longer important was really the day I started to understand what importance looks like now. Not in being needed, but in being there. Even when the world around you has learned how to move on without asking you how. I sat there for a long time that night. The house quiet again. The same familiar sounds. The same light. The same space. But something inside me had settled. Not completely. Not perfectly. But enough. Enough to know that this isn't the end of something. It's just a different place in the same story. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like something I could live with.